There was a shadow stationed on a desert hill, until his tattoo told the story of a village saved. Before we begin, share in the comments what time you're watching this video today. Under the scorching July sun, the endless deserts of Arizona stretched across the horizon. On one dusty hill, 4 soldiers were stationed. Silence reigned, broken only by the faint whisper of wind blowing sand across the dunes. Their mission, to prevent possible illegal crossings along the border. There was no visible threat. But one of them stood apart from the others, Jim Hawkins. Jim was quiet. He didn't talk, didn't joke, didn't move without orders. One of the younger soldiers, Paul, had noticed from day one that Jim was different. His movements were measured, his gaze calculating. The rifle in his hands wasn't just a weapon, it was part of his body. Before every patrol, Jim followed the same ritual, carefully placing his helmet, cleaning his scope, checking his rifle 3 times. This wasn't ordinary discipline, it was the echo of something long past. That day was one of the hottest in the summer of 1925. The sky was veiled in a yellowish haze, the sun's rays hitting the earth like lead. As Jim knelt into position, a tattoo appeared on the inside of his arm. Paul caught a glimpse, an eagle with its wings spread wide, and underneath, the numbers, 1968. Paul shivered. That couldn't be possible. It was 1925. Vietnam was still 4 decades away. There had to be a mistake. But no, the tattoo was old, ink faded into the skin, bearing the weight of years. Paul glanced at the others, but no one had mentioned the tattoo. Maybe they hadn't seen it. Or maybe they had, and chose silence. Because Jim's oddity went far beyond just the ink on his arm. That night, while the other soldiers ate their canned meals around the campfire, Jim sat alone, a little distance away. Paul quietly approached him. "That tattoo. 1968, he said. That year hasn't happened yet." Jim stared into the fire. "Some wars never make it into the history books," he murmured. "But their marks remain." Paul didn't know what to say. He simply nodded and walked away. But from that moment on, he saw Jim differently. He wasn't just a quiet sharpshooter anymore, he was a riddle, torn from another time. During their morning patrols, Jim's foresight was uncanny. When he saw a dust cloud far off, he'd say, "A rider's coming," and sure enough, minutes later, a horseman would appear. When the radio signals grew faint, he'd say, "Storm's approaching," and not long after, the sky would crack with thunder. It was as if nature itself whispered to him. One day, word came of a suspicious border crossing. HQ dispatched a 4-man team to the area. Jim volunteered. Paul insisted on going with him. Once on site, the trail had seemingly vanished. But Jim crouched down, studied the ground, and immediately pointed. "They passed through here," he said. 2 people. 1 injured. Paul was stunned. There were barely any tracks. Yet Jim followed them, silently, carefully. After an hour of walking, they found 2 migrants behind a rock. One of them was indeed wounded. Jim administered first aid without hesitation. Paul watched quietly. This man wasn't just a soldier. He was trained. Perhaps even more than that. On the way back, Paul couldn't hold it in. "What are you?" he asked. "Are you, from outside time?" Jim smiled. "Just a soldier," he replied. "But sometimes, some missions can't wait for their time." That night, Paul dreamt of uniforms marked 1968. Helicopters exploding, men hiding in the jungle, and in the middle of it all, a lone figure aiming quietly, Jim. The next morning, Paul woke up to an empty camp. Jim was gone. The commander said Jim had gone on patrol alone during the morning check, and never returned. No sign. No tracks. As if he'd never existed. Years later, after Paul retired, he immersed himself in the library's old newspaper archives. He found a report about a sniper who served in Vietnam in 1968. Codename, Eagle. There was only one photo in the file, a man with eyes locked onto the horizon through a scope. Paul couldn't hold back his tears. Who was Jim, really? And we still ask, do some soldiers fall outside of time, or is it we who fail to grasp their time? The silence that began with the sight of the tattoo echoed deeply in Paul's mind. As the sky still shimmered red, returning to camp, only one thought haunted him. Could it really have been him? That night, instead of retreating to his tent in the desert's cool air, Paul went to the camp's small archive tent. He spent hours among dusty files and yellowed reports. Finally, he found a document titled Vietnam, 1968, Rural Operations. The record was incomplete, but one paragraph stood out. A lone sniper provided fire cover from a high point for 12 straight hours, preventing over 50 civilians from being executed by the Viet Cong. After the operation, villagers recalled the open-winged eagle tattoo on his arm. Paul traced every word of the paragraph with his fingertip. No name was mentioned. But the description, it was Jim Hawkins. Eagle tattoo, high hill, alone, it's him. He whispered to himself, swallowing with excitement. He could barely wait for morning. At dawn, as the sun painted the desert sky, Paul found him once more at the hilltop. Jim, as always, was quiet, cleaning his rifle. The wind played with his hair and rang against the rifle's metal. Paul took a deep breath. Approaching, he knelt and said, almost too softly for the wind to carry. Sergeant Hawkins. That tattoo yesterday. Were you the one who saved that village in Vietnam? Jim stopped. He put the rifle down and looked at Paul. There was a glint in his eyes, not anger, not pride, but weariness, the weight of a memory fossilized in time. He lowered his head. There were children in that village, he said quietly. When they stopped speaking, it meant death had come. So they stayed silent. And so did I. Paul's eyes welled up. Why didn't you ever say anything, he asked. Jim's reply was short and firm. Heroism asks for silence, not a show. From that moment on, Jim's silence carried a deeper meaning. The other soldiers still knew him only as the old sniper. But to Paul, he was now a living piece of history. A few days later, Jim didn't show up to the hill one morning. Noticing his absence, Paul rushed to find him. He found him behind the base camp, beneath an old tree, scribbling something into a notebook. Jim closed the notebook and handed it over. These things are no longer considered to have happened. But go ahead and read it. Maybe one day, you'll need to tell the story. Paul's hands trembled as he took the notebook. I will, he said. As the sun rose, Jim began walking toward the hill. With his rifle on his back and the tattoo on his arm, he moved like history itself, heavy as memory, silent as the wind. Paul started watching him from a distance. The lookout post on the hill began to resemble Jim more and more with each passing day, silent, patient, unshakable. Every shot, every glance, it was as if Jim's mind was still in the deep jungles of Vietnam, in the middle of combat. Every morning, he sat in the same spot, cleaned his rifle, and stared into the horizon through his scope. It was like he was waiting for something, maybe something that would never come. Paul tried to understand that silence. One day, he gathered the courage to approach the base commander. What do you know about Sergeant Hawkins? He asked. The commander paused and looked straight into Paul's eyes. James Hawkins, he said gravely. A retired sniper. Quiet man. But sometimes, the way he looks, everything around him falls silent. The way he stands, it feels like there's a whole army behind him. When Paul mentioned the tattoo and what he found in the archives, the commander's brow furrowed. An eagle tattoo? He asked in disbelief. Are you sure? Paul nodded. The commander leaned in and added in a hushed voice. There was once a major operation out here in the desert. It was about to fail. The radio was down, the unit scattered. And suddenly, everything changed. One by one, the targets dropped. nobody knew what happened. Later, I saw Hawkins sitting on a rock, just staring at the sky. But the operation was saved. Those words echoed in Paul's mind. That night, he went back into the archives, deeper this time, trying to access sealed files. He now knew the right keywords: Vietnam, 1968, village raid, lone sniper. One document stood out. In a battered folder, on yellowed paper, was a heading: Operation Eagle Eye. It was sealed with a government stamp, but a few lines were visible. A village held captive by Viet Cong. Sergeant J.H. attempts solo infiltration. 50 civilians rescued. Sniper eliminates enemy units one by one. Witness accounts mention a man with an eagle tattoo on his arm. Paul's heart pounded. Jim was that sergeant. The initials, the date, the tattoo, the method, everything matched. But why was he now waiting on a hilltop in the desert? Why the silence? Why hadn't he told anyone? The next morning, Paul went to Jim with the document in hand. Jim, as always, was cleaning his rifle. The sun deepened the lines on his forehead. In a trembling voice, Paul said, "Sergeant Hawkins. I read the file. That was you, wasn't it?" Jim paused. He slowly closed the rifle. He looked up, but not at Paul. He stared into the distance. "That night, there was no wind," he said softly. "I could hear the children crying in the village. The enemy was everywhere. I had to make a choice. Leave them there, or..." He went silent. A long pause. "I wasn't just a sniper," he finally said. "I was their only hope. But after that night, something changed in me. You saved someone, yes. But the moment, the look in their eyes, the fear, it never leaves you." Paul offered the file to Jim. Jim glanced at the edge of the paper but didn't take it. "That's the past," he said. "And some things should stay there." At that moment, Paul understood his secret. War wasn't fought only on the battlefield, it raged within, too. And some heroes chose silence. Because the heaviest memories were too sharp to be spoken aloud. And men like Jim carried that weight not behind a rifle, but deep within their hearts. After learning Jim's past, Paul slowly began to spread the story around the base. At first, Jim was just seen as an old, quiet man. But the perception began to shift. During guard shifts, soldiers started saluting him. At lunch, they began sitting beside him. One young soldier came up to him one day and said, "Sir, there's so much we could learn from you." Jim looked up and made eye contact, just once. In the eyes of these young soldiers, he saw a kind of respect he hadn't felt in years. One morning, an elderly man appeared at the base gate. His uniform was worn, his steps heavy. He held a yellowed letter in his hand. His name was George. Approaching the guard, he asked, "Is James Hawkins here?" His trembling yet determined voice hinted at a long-awaited reunion. Paul rushed over and brought George inside. Jim was cleaning his rifle as usual. When they met eyes, George slowly held out his hands. "I was in that village in 1968. We thought we were all going to die. Then I saw you. You crouched at the edge of the field like an eagle. Every bullet saved a life. I'm alive because of you." Everyone fell silent. Jim lowered his head, not with pride, not with arrogance. But feeling the weight of that day once more on his shoulders. News spread quickly. Now, everyone knew who Jim was. Within a week, the base commander organized a special ceremony. On the day of the event, a military parade was arranged, flags raised, dignitaries assembled. A custom-made vintage uniform was presented to Jim. He put it on, buttoned it, picked up his rifle, and slung his old scope over his shoulder. As he stepped onto the stage, everyone stood. For a moment, there was silence. Then the commander approached the microphone. "Sergeant James Hawkins. Your silence has been our safety. Your humility, our inspiration. Today, on this base, we honor not just a man, but a legend." Amid applause, Jim rolled up his right sleeve and revealed his tattoo. An eagle holding an olive branch in its talons. Soldiers saluted. Eyes welled with tears. At that moment, a forgotten story from the corner of the desert was rewritten. After the ceremony, newspapers in Arizona ran front-page headlines. "Eagle of the Desert, the return of a silent hero." His resilience, both in war and in peace, was shared across the state. Every day, more people visited the base. Young people, elders, veterans, some to thank him, others just to silently salute. One morning, Paul handed Jim a small note. It was written on brown paper. Just one sentence. "This base is proud of your honor." Jim read the note and held it for a while. Then slowly leaned against his rifle. Gazing toward the horizon, he whispered, "Maybe the eagle can rise here too." From that day on, everyone called him the Eagle of the Desert. The National Defense Museum reached out to Jim, asking him to donate his personal artifacts. Jim sent his scope, his rifle, and his worn uniform. Each was a silent witness to an era. At the museum's opening ceremony, an elderly man stepped onto the stage. His hands trembling behind his glasses, he touched Jim's uniform. "This man saved my life," he said. And he expected nothing in return. For the first time, Jim was visibly moved. His eyes filled, but he didn't cry. He had always been a silent hero. But now, his silence echoed with honor. And maybe, the end of this story begins with a simple, profound question. Have you ever known someone like Jim? A monument of honor in the desert?